バリバリ?
I've been here in Japan since the pandemic started, and after a long time of very strict border control during the pandemic, the country is opening up again, and some people might be interested about coming here or moving here. So I thought I'd talk a bit about what it's been like during the pandemic, what it's like now, and what I think it might be like after the pandemic. So first off, something that was quite different here in Japan, perhaps compared to Western countries, is people have been wearing masks the whole time. So as soon as there was a mention of coronavirus, everybody had their mask on, and I basically haven't really seen a stranger's face since then. Of course, when people are in restaurants or cafes, they take them off to drink their coffee or eat their food, but after that, the mask is back on when they go outside. And even now, when I think a lot of other countries are starting to get very relaxed with wearing masks, here in Japan, when you walk out in the street, everybody's wearing a mask, even when there's a big distance between everybody. So if you do visit Japan soon, you should probably wear a mask, because you don't want to be, the one foreign person that isn't wearing a mask, because everybody is still wearing them. And this isn't any kind of government mandate. The government is not enforcing this. I think the main reason is Japan is quite famous for its kind of group activity, or its kind of way of working as a group. So you don't want to be the one person that's not doing this. So even recently, the Prime Minister came on TV and said, you don't have to wear masks when you go outside, but people are still wearing masks, I think, because most people don't want to be the first person to take their mask off. So at least where I live, where I walk around, most people are still walking around with their masks on. And this has perhaps helped Japan keep relatively low numbers of infections and deaths during the pandemic, even though the rollout of vaccines got started a little bit slowly. I think many countries started in January. Japan didn't really get started properly until around April, but then by November, most people had been vaccinated, at least most people that wanted to be vaccinated or could be vaccinated. It's over 80% now, and I think basically the only people left are people that don't want to or can't be vaccinated. So in terms of safety, like compared to other countries, Japan is a pretty safe country to come to. So if you're worried, if I go to Japan, is there a risk of catching coronavirus? I think it's probably much less than a lot of other countries, because like I said, most people are vaccinated. A lot of people now are even getting their booster shots. Everyone's wearing masks basically all the time. And every store, every supermarket, you'll see like alcohol for wiping their hands on the way in and the way out. And most people I see are using those facilities. So in terms of lockdown, as I mentioned earlier, Japan hasn't had a proper lockdown. And that is because the government actually doesn't have the legal capacity to enforce a lockdown. I don't understand why. I don't know enough details about the politics to know why, but I know like some countries like Spain, I think in America, perhaps in some other countries, the government was, like arresting people if they went outside when they weren't supposed to and things like that. But in Japan, the government can't do that. So the government has just strongly urged people to stay at home and to wear masks and not to go in groups to restaurants and things. But luckily, Japanese people in general follow rules. If you've ever been to Japan, you've probably seen people queuing up in an orderly manner to get on the train. When you're on the train, you'll see that people are not answering their phones. There are signs that say, please don't answer your phone when you're on the train. And even when I see people who have some kind of urgent work matter, I'll see them answer their phone and they'll be like, sorry, I'm on the train. I'll need to call you back in a moment. Okay, I'm so sorry. I'll have to call you back. And then they just hang up. And even though that call seems quite urgent, they won't answer it on the train because the sign says don't do that. And they don't want to bother other people around them. So in general, in Japan, it's very orderly. A lot of people are following the rules and a lot of people are working together as a group. And that's something that has been pretty good during the pandemic, because that means the rate of infection has been relatively low here, especially for a country with such a big, dense population. So living here during the pandemic has been pretty relaxed compared to what I've seen in other countries. I come from the UK, and there was one point when the government said you cannot meet in a group of more than 6 people. Whereas, like I said, in Japan, there hasn't been any actual enforcement of these rules. It's just been the government urging people to do these things. So there hasn't been that kind of pressure. but most people just follow these kind of guidelines anyway. Of course, there are some people that don't, but most people, most businesses are following the guidelines, and everything's been working otherwise pretty much quite normally. You can still go to a restaurant, you can still go to a cafe, you can even still go and get a drink. There was a small period when alcohol was kind of prohibited, well, again, like kind of asked to be prohibited, but I think, you know, in a lot of other countries, there have been very strict kind of lockdowns and restrictions on those things. But in Japan, as long as you're wearing a mask, putting alcohol in your hand, keeping your distance, not getting in a big group, you've still been able to do a lot of these normal kind of things. One measure that was a bit strict that really affected me personally is recently my wife and I had a baby. And during that time, this was 8 months ago when my daughter was born, I was not allowed in the hospital at all. So that even means during the birth, I wasn't allowed to be in there to see my daughter being born. And even after she was born, my wife had to stay in the hospital for a week to recover with my daughter. So I only saw my daughter through kind of video chat for the first week of her life, and I didn't actually get to meet her until a week later. So that's been one thing that affected me personally, but that's probably a rare case. So the one thing that has been very strict here is border control, and that's another thing that's affected me personally because, as I just said, I've just had a daughter, and my mom, my dad, my family, they still haven't had a chance to meet my daughter. And then even before my daughter was born, it'd been a while since I visited my family in the UK, and I was thinking about going back, but I was quite worried that if I went, I wasn't going to be allowed back into Japan because that was happening to a lot of people. I'm actually just on a spouse visa, but there were people who even had permanent residence, which is kind of a step up from what I have. And even those people that, you know, they work here, they live here, perhaps they have family here. They'd left the country just before the pandemic, and then they weren't being allowed to come back into the country. And I kind of understand being closed off to tourism for a while, especially when the pandemic was at its peak, but closing off to residents who live here and have a job here, that didn't seem very fair to me, especially when Japanese citizens could still come back in. So if you were a Japanese citizen, you could enter, but if you had a residency, you weren't allowed back in, even though basically your lifestyle here would be pretty similar. So now the visa situation, and I'm recording this video in June 2022. I don't know when you'll end up watching this, but at this point, workers, like people on business can come here, students can come here, and they've just started to open up to tourists. But tourists are only allowed to come in a group on a guided tour going to specific places, which to me sounds a little bit like North Korean style tourism. So I don't know if that sounds very enjoyable, but it sounds like a lot of people are still jumping on the chance to do that. And this is being used as a kind of trial to see if tourists come into Japan, is it going to have an effect on the infection rate? And unfortunately, I saw some news today that said that a tourist coming into Japan has already tested positive for COVID. So I don't know if this happens a couple of times, if they're going to just completely close the border again. I'm not sure how the Japanese government is going to respond to that. So it's hard to know what's going to happen going ahead with visas and border control. You know, like it's slowly opening up, but if these little cases break out when tourists come, is it going to completely close up again? Or are they going to continue opening up because that would be the best thing for the economy? It's really hard to know what the Japanese government is going to do. If you do know what the Japanese government is going to do, if you could predict that, that would be some kind of superpower. So the last topic I need to address, because I imagine most people watching this are not Japanese, you are non-Japanese people that want to come to Japan. Has racism changed or increased during the pandemic? Well, unfortunately, Japan, like every country, when things go wrong, who do you blame? The foreigners, or perhaps the poor people. But during the pandemic, it's been a lot of blaming foreign people. In America, we've seen some very violent crime towards especially Asian people. Fortunately, in Japan, at least from what I've seen in the news, it hasn't been so violent. And that is not surprising because Japan's violent crime is very low anyway. But then it's also hard to tell because Japan is a country which is 98% ethnically Japanese, which means the foreign population here is very, very small. And it means that the media doesn't cover kind of issues for foreign people that much, like we see in more multicultural countries like America or the UK, where I'm from. Something I saw in the media a bit during the beginning of the pandemic was a rise in racism towards Chinese people or other non-Japanese Asian people here in Japan. So living here as a Westerner, especially as a white Westerner, I haven't faced much direct racism. The biggest problem I've had, and that a lot of other people have had, is finding an apartment. When looking for an apartment or a place to rent, there's quite a bit of discrimination towards foreigners, because landlords, from what I've heard, believe that foreigners might run away without paying the rent. They might be dirty or noisy. Basically, these kind of stereotypes you get in a country when 98% of people are one ethnicity and they haven't had much experience meeting people of other ethnicities. But apart from that, most of the kind of racism I experience in Japan is more just a little annoying microaggressions. And have I personally felt an increase in sort of discrimination during the pandemic? Then no, I haven't. For me, nothing has changed during the pandemic. That's for me personally. Like I said, if you're a Chinese person coming to live in Japan, that might be different, or coming from some other countries. But just from my experience as a white Westerner, nothing has really changed for me in terms of discrimination. So with all that being said, should you come to Japan or should you move to Japan? Well, that is up to you. But personally, I don't think you should let the pandemic affect that decision, because as I said, compared to some other countries, Japan has actually been safer in terms of not getting infected, and probably still is safer. It's been much more peaceful here, I think, than a lot of other countries during the pandemic. So these, like, I've seen videos of people in America, for example, I think probably in other countries too, where people were just trying to start a fight. They were walking into businesses without wearing a mask and being like, I'm here to exercise my right to freedom. And then when people start shouting at them and say, come on, like, you know, the sign says, please wear a mask, they're like, my freedom. And they're kind of just looking for a fight. I haven't really seen any of that in Japan. Most people just said, oh, I need to wear a mask. Okay, I'll put on a mask. Of course, there might be some rare cases, but it's not really something we've seen much on the news. I think at the beginning there was a couple of videos, but really nothing compared to what I've seen in other countries. So it's been very peaceful here, and the chance of being infected is pretty low compared to other places. And those two things still continue now. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, like every country, discrimination does exist here, but it's always existed, and it might have increased a bit for some groups in Japan. But if you're a Westerner and you're coming here, then I don't think anything has really changed there, and it probably won't change anytime soon. So the best thing for you to do here on out, in my opinion, is probably just focus on studying Japanese, because personally, I study Japanese every day for many hours, and I think that makes my experience more enjoyable and much easier than perhaps some other people. I hear some people complaining about, you know, getting paperwork and they can't get like an English version of the paperwork, or there's something they want to do and they don't have some kind of English service. Because there are a lot of English speakers in Japan, especially if you're just coming here as a tourist, then you probably don't, you know, it would be nice for you to study some Japanese, but you don't need to. You know, you can buy coffee, you can get a train ticket, you can do those things. But if you want to live here and you want to do your taxes, you want to go to the doctor, you want to just generally live a life, even join a gym or something, you definitely do need to speak Japanese to do those things if you don't want someone holding your hand during the whole process all the time. So while you're stuck in your country thinking, I want to go to Japan, just use this time to focus on studying Japanese. And then when you get here, your experience will be much more enjoyable and just easier in general. So that's all from me. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe. Don't forget to like if you thought it was useful or entertaining in some way. Also comment and let me know what things you'd like to hear about. I just started this channel. I've been in Japan for a long time. I've been studying Japanese for a long time. I've been sort of enjoying Japanese media and reading Japanese newspapers and things. So if you have any questions about Japan, then please do ask me and I'll try to make a video about those topics. So thank you all very much. See you next time.